Innate helps companies avoid project surprises, make better informed decisions, share knowledge, and deliver better outcomes. Innate, transforming the way the world builds.
Hello, project people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's always good to have you with us. We don't have everyone today. We have Dale off today, but we do have Mr. Martin, Machine Gun Martin. How are you, sir?
Very good, thanks. And yourself?
I'm good. I'm very good. And it's good to have a new guest and more of the technical field as well today. I think a lot of the time we do some, more behavioral leadership, philosophy type guests, but I am a bit of a geek, and I know you are too, Martin. So today we'll do a bit of geek speak with our friend Santosh Bhat. Santosh, thanks for being here today, mate. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks, Val. Thanks, Martin.
It's good to have you, my friend, because I know we've had a very short podcast engagement together, but we haven't had a long podcast form. And for something that you do, Santosh, and I know for you it's it's easy pie, but for a lot of us, you're talking foreign terms, and I know some of the listeners are really struggling out there. I know you know this, but there are a lot of big projects going on at the moment, massive infrastructure and civil projects. And one of the things we talk about is a plan on a page. And, this is all about getting to simplicity and allowing our teams to work together and have an integrated view of what's really happening out there in the field. And it's been a challenge. And I think a lot of people will benefit from understanding what you do and how you do it. But Santosh, from my perspective, I want to get to a point of baseline understanding, and I always start with this. Martin knows this, with definitions, because I think sometimes we get lost in words, and there are a lot of buzzwords out there. So plan on a page is a very simple one. But how would you define time chainage, or some of the other names or terms it's called, in a real simple view?
Okay, so in a really simplistic way, it essentially is a schedule. It's a form of presenting activities from a project schedule. The key difference between, I guess, a traditional Gantt chart, which is what we're used to seeing, a bar chart where the times are across the page and every activity is represented by a single bar. The difference with these time location charts, as I call them, is you're adding a second dimension to it, which is a location, or where an activity is occurring, as well as when. And what that lets you then do is imagine a grid where you've got time as one axis and a second axis representing a physical location. Then you're able to plot, well, not just when activities are happening, but where they're occurring as well. So the fundamental difference, and the way I like to explain it, is when we see a typical Gantt chart, the vertical axis typically consists of a work breakdown structure, or some sort of some sort of coding hierarchy which lets you organize, but you're essentially limited to one task or one activity per row. Now imagine, instead of having a WBS, you have a grid line that represents a physical location. And on linear projects such as a highway or a tunnel, the start to end point of that project is a really good linear axis. You can imagine a 40-kilometer motorway. You start at 0 and you've got 40 kilometers, and then you use that grid to define, well, where is everything happening? So if you've got a piece of work that's happening in the first 2 kilometers, well, there's your 0 to 2 for location, and then the dates for that task are spread across the horizontal axis. The only difference is most of the time you see these charts, especially on horizontal linear projects, the chart's drawn rotated. So we have the time on the vertical scale and the linear scales across the horizontal scale. That's the only fundamental difference.
And it seems to me, and I don't know how Martin feels about this, but that seems to be the challenging part when people see the time has moved, because we're so used to, I think from school even, we're so used to time being on the horizontal, aren't we? And to change that, you're actually changing the paradigm of how you view that information. And one of the questions I've got is around, well, but actually, before we get there, let's step back a bit. How did you get involved in time chainage? Where did it start for you?
Sure. So a long time ago, it seems, back in the early 2000s, when I was first cutting my teeth in the world of planning and scheduling, I was working on a job for a fiber optic rollout. So this is laying thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable around Australia. The purest type of linear project you can think of. You've got this thin, essentially fiber optic cable being laid for hundreds and thousands of kilometers. And I was working with my my boss at the time, and my mentor and friend, Robert Turner was his name. And he actually found a piece of software that integrated with Primavera P3 back in those days, an old German piece of software called Linea, Linea. And what this let you do was, by assigning some attributes to activities in Primavera P3, you could actually present them on this chart that did exactly just as I explained to you. And what we were able to do is to then say, right, so very clearly on a single page, we can represent the long runs of this rolling this cable out. Because with fiber optic networks, the way they work is you can lay the cable for about 100 kilometers, and then you have to put a repeater station in that basically grabs the grabs the optical signal and amplifies it for the next 100 kilometers. So every 100 kilometers, you've got effectively a hut that grabs this signal and expands it. And then you've got this section of cable in between. So you can imagine for a section such as Sydney to Melbourne, which is about 800 meters, 800 kilometers, you've got 9 of these huts, or well, actually you've got 2 major centers, and you've got 6 huts and lengths of cable in between them. And you've got to juggle all the, you've got to the design, the site access, you've got to get permission to go and get onto the land, you've got environmental issues, you've got the actual construction issues, and then you've got the commissioning. Now, when you're putting together a project like this, the designers, they say, what would be ideal is we could commission from the major capital cities and work inwards. That way we have one continuous network. But when you actually start planning these projects, what you find is, due to all those other constraints that I just mentioned, it's very rare that you get this nice continuous workflow from the ends into the middle. So you're always constantly trying to juggle, which section do we get access to first, which one is the so throwing all that into the mix, when you've got hundreds of these huts and thousands of kilometers worth of work, we found that this representation using time chainage was by far the more, far more effective way of presenting the schedule than printing out Gantt charts. So we worked on this project, we worked with P3, we developed the program or the schedule, and instead of up on the wall sticking up Gantt charts and saying, look at the schedule, everyone, we actually started producing these time chainage diagrams, and people were looking at that going, oh, that's interesting. What's all that about? And by that, I mean, one thing, the lesson I learned was by taking away the Gantt chart, and in particular, taking away pages and pages and pages of Gantt chart, what you actually do is you make the schedule something that's more engaging. People get interested in it. People tend to want to look at it. And the moment people start looking at the schedule, you also get their feedback, which is a very important aspect of planning and scheduling. It should never be done in isolation or in silos. So the more engaging you can make the schedule, the far more effective it is.
Did you have to spend a lot of time explaining this concept to people, and probably getting around some of the unconscious incompetence maybe?
Absolutely, yes, that's definitely the case. And following from that project, literally for the next, ever since then, any opportunity I get to present schedules in this format, I do. And one of the most common things we have to do is that, exactly as you said, Martin, is that, and there's a classic story that I like to say, where we presented this to someone once, and he was like, "What is this rubbish? Put it away. I'm not interested. Give me the the Primavera printout." And we said, "No, please, just give us a few minutes of your time." And we explained on this chart, here's the areas and the location, here's the dates, and look at all these things on there. And the bit you're looking after is this bit in here. And I like to say, you could literally see the light bulb turning on. Like the face was just like, wow, am I really seeing all of this information here in front of me? And from then on, there was no more request for Primavera anymore. It was always just, have you updated the time change? Where's my latest time change? Give me one that I can scribble on, and they would take it away. And we even got to a point on some projects where we would laminate these charts and give people whiteboard markers to say, go away and play with it. Because we found that that was actually a more useful way of them, just playing and seeing what they could do. And, to me, that's a win as a planner, because, you're getting someone looking at something that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, I think we can agree, and about a lot of our listeners, about the pages and pages of Gantt charts, and just how do you simplify, the CPM method, which is still valid. And I've seen some of your debates online with LinkedIn about project planning, and I'm with you, Santosh. I mean, there's a place for everything, right? And I think some of these methods are good, and this is the challenge we have, right? I think with all these different methods, which one rules the nest? And for me, it goes back to just keeping things simple. The idea of trying to make things complex because they are complicated doesn't need to be the case. We can actually draw out the themes that are important to us, and then we can have, I guess, what we'd call the undercarriage of information. So my idea is that things like the time chainage and plans on a page and dashboards are kind of like an indicator of interest. You've got an overview of what's happening. Then if you want to dive into the information, you can, because it's all still there. It's all still relevant, and it's being driven by what we call a single source of truth. Santosh, have you heard that before?
No, I've heard that a few times. Yeah.
So my question is, how do you start? So if someone's listening to this, Santosh, they go, man, this sounds pretty cool. Where do you start planning with this, in terms of, if I want to use a linear project template or chainage diagram template, and I want to start placing these things? You mentioned it links to P3. I imagine it links to P6 now. How do you get that information all organized? Do you need to be trained in time chainage, or can you just start to group information together to get that view?
It certainly doesn't require any specific training. That's one thing straight off the bat. So obviously you need to be able to drive the scheduling software. So you have to have the capacity to operate Primavera or Microsoft Project or whatever your preferred scheduling tool is. But the way, so there's this essentially two methods of working with these charts, right? One is where you actually do your planning on the chart itself. So that might be a case where you have, let's say, for instance, you have a blank chart and you start defining activities on the chart itself, and you figure out, we might do this then, and we might shift this around. The issue with that is that, first of all, you need those activities to be logically linked. And what I mean by that is that if you do say, one of these tasks might take an extra month, what you want to see is the knock-on effect. That by delaying something by a month, what is the knock-on effect? So in order to do that, you need to have a scheduling algorithm built onto the chart itself. Now, there is a popular piece of software that does that, allows you to generate these charts freehand and has a scheduling algorithm behind it. I've never liked that particular method. And so the method that I tend to use is kind of the opposite, where I say, well, we already have a scheduling engine. We already have scheduling software that we're all familiar with. What do we need to do to get from the scheduling software to the chart? So I tend to use the time location chart more as just a graphical output, and the scheduling software is where the actual, the work is done. So that's where the data is kept. Any changes. So for instance, if you want to see the effect of that activity taking 1 month longer, do that in your scheduling engine, because that's what it's designed for. It's a scheduling engine, right? It contains all the relationships, all the resources, and all the connections that you need. So if you're trained on how to use the scheduling software, the only additional attributes you need to think about is defining where an activity occurs. So we mentioned earlier that you might have a linear axis. You might say, this is an activity that's going for my first 2 kilometers. So you can either define it as being from 0 to 2,000 meters, right? That can be like a definition that you just add some extra values against an activity, or you may even just leave it as just defining it by area 1, area 2, area 3, for example. And then the second thing you need to think about is, how do I want these displayed on the chart? Because it is important on how you decide how these activities get displayed on these charts. And we can probably talk about that in a moment. But at its simplest level, it's, I want this activity to appear as a blue box. I want this activity to appear as a gray line. I want this activity to be a milestone. You do need to make a decision on that. But essentially, that's just a tagging exercise. You're just adding a couple of extra pieces of data to every task in your schedule. So if you already know how to use Primavera or Microsoft Project, you're 80% of the way to producing these charts anyway.
Did you say it could handle resources in there, or is
No, I'm
it
saying
almost
the
a separate
scheduling,
the
scheduling
scheduling
software
does,
where the resource management is maintained, and that's why I like using that option rather than the first option that I presented, is because your scheduling software, that's where everything is kept, right? And if you're doing a resource leveling exercise, to me, the risk in the first method, as well as maintaining a scheduling software, is that there's a disconnect. Right? You might make changes in one that don't reflect in the other, and that could lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I think you already kind of alluded to it. And if you want to share screen, I see it, you've got one behind you. And as you said, the colors are probably important. Can you explain how you would potentially group the colors? Is it by discipline or resource, as Martin was saying? How do you go about, color shading the time chainage?
Yeah, I mean, the colors, so we tend to use colors to represent disciplines of work. So if I go back to that example I was talking about, the fiber optic layout project. So when you're constructing these huts, you might decide that, building the foundation for each hut, we're going to represent that as a blue box. So you'll see hundreds of these blue boxes around the chart, and you straight away know every time I see a blue box, that's representing the foundation work. We may put the actual, let's say you're excavating, to lay the cable in the ground. We might represent all the excavation activities as a green line. So then, when I look at these charts and I see a green line, I know that that's excavation. But that then starts enabling a lot more discussion. And this is perhaps where our discussion can head down, is you start seeing these green lines together on a page, and you can start asking questions about, well, why is there a gap there? Or, why have we got multiple green lines all happening at the same time in the same space? That doesn't make sense. So it lets you start asking those type of questions. But essentially, the recommendation is you group like activities using the similar colors and shapes on these charts. The shapes themselves have some representation. I don't know if you perhaps should expand on that a little bit. So when you use an area or a box, what you're actually representing on these charts is to say, I have a piece of work, an activity that's occupying this area for the length of time, right? So, let's just go back to our very simple example of 0 to 2 kilometers. Like, let's say that represents earthworks. Okay, so we're doing earthworks over a 2 kilometer stretch for 6 months. We might draw that as a box that's spanning 6 months and covering 2 kilometers. So you know that in that space and time, this type of work is occurring. Okay, so a box is work that's occupying space for a fixed amount of time. Whereas if you use a shape that's got a gradient, such as a line, you're actually adding another more useful piece of information, which is also a rate of progress. So you're actually now saying, we're starting at this point on this date, and we're finishing at this point on this date. Therefore, the angle of the line represents a rate of production. Right.
That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you say we're planning on doing something at 100 meters per day, right, you expect to see that as a certain angle. Whereas if you then say we're doing the next task at only 50 meters per day, it'll be at a different angle, and you'll start seeing that very clearly on these charts to say there's a difference in the rate of production. And what that leads to is lots of other useful bits of information, such as, why is the rate of production for the same type of work different in different areas, right? Is that just a mistake that we made in the schedule, or is there a valid reason for it? You might find the soil conditions are different, or we might have double the crews, so therefore we're working twice as fast. There's all these questions that can come out of looking at these charts. And then the third dimension to those lines is also the direction. right? You might be working in one direction and the chart's drawn in this way, whereas if you're working in the other direction, the lines will go in the opposite direction, which when you're planning these projects is also of importance, because you might think about things like you've got a work site or a camp or a depot, and all the works may need to come out of the depot. And so you may have an interesting situation where some of the works are occurring in one direction and some of the works are occurring in a second direction. Is there interference? Is there an issue? I mean, this, without diving into the detail, I mean, the benefit of these charts is that all of those kind of planning related issues just jump out at you visually, which would otherwise get lost in the Gantt chart.
Yeah, that's great. I think as well, just noting those angles is a really good idea, because sometimes we do, I mean, that is one of the things, the problems with planning. When you're planning multiple things of the same size, you know, you want to know progress. And so does it also then provide a line in terms of your status against the plan? Because obviously this is pulling in the planned effort from the program, let's say. How do you then measure the progress? Do you put a line on the plan? Do you add status in terms of percent complete? How do you do that?
So using, as I mentioned, there's two methods. Using that first method, you could potentially do that. The complication with measuring progress on these charts is, and let me take a step back, because when we typically measure progress in our scheduling software, you know, we have a planned start and a planned finish for tasks. But when you're measuring progress, what you might do is you might place an actual start, and then you put a percent complete, which may then define what's the remaining duration, which then defines when you expect the task to finish. When you're working in time location world, you've got an added complication, because not only do you have to measure the actual start and the remaining duration, but you actually need to define, well, where did we actually start in terms of a location? Where are we up to in the location, and what's the remaining location? So you've actually introduced 3 additional pieces of information that are required to progress measure if you're working in that manner. So I tend to, you know, think that's just making life unnecessarily complex for managing it. And I just go back to my principle that says, well, the data's already there in your scheduling software when you calculate a remaining duration and therefore a planned finish. So what we'll just do is we'll just use that, right? There's a simple rule that says anything earlier than the status date is an actual, and anything later than the status date is a forecast, right?
Yeah, no, that makes, so really what it's showing is remaining work would be the easiest way to.
Yeah, and so what we've, I mean, in the software that I've been working on, we've actually allow you to do a comparison between versions of schedules. So much like you might place a baseline bar and a current bar in your scheduling software, we allow you to do a baseline chart and a current chart overlaid on top of it. And we've got some smarts in there that let you differentiate between the two. And so you can then see visually, well, here's when we planned on doing it, and here's where we're actually forecasting on where it will be. And it doesn't require any additional information to what you've entered into the scheduling software.
Well, that's what my next question was going to be, Santosh, around baselines, because again, one of the values of having a planning tool is to see where are we moving too much. You get that month end, you do an update, you see we're slipping. Are we slipping on something that's important? Are we slipping on something that's critical? Are we eroding float? Where are we eroding float? And it gets a bit messy, because other than the planners and maybe some really competent project managers, it's lost in the noise until it's hitting something critical, right? And that by that time it's too late. So you mentioned it says it captures baselines. How does it do that? How do you represent that visually on the time change dashboard?
Sure. So I mean, look, essentially a baseline is a schedule, right? It's just a schedule with a set of dates. The only difference between a baseline and a current schedule is you may have fewer or no actual dates. Like if you think about the baseline that's set at the beginning of a project, in theory, you shouldn't have any actual dates, and it's all a remaining forecast. So we will grab that schedule, we'll grab the dates, we can even grab what are the critical activities of that particular version of the schedule and present that on a chart. So we can draw that on the chart. We can highlight which are the critical activities. So you actually get a critical path. It can look a little bit strange on these time location charts because we're using CPM criticality, not what's called a linear scheduling criticality, which is a whole other topic. But we can present that as a chart. Now, as you progress on your project, we typically update our schedules on a regular basis, be that weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, however often. What you're actually doing is each update is effectively another version of a schedule, right? With a mix of actuals and remaining forecasts. So what we can do is actually at any point is transfer that update into our tool, and it just gets presented as another version of a schedule. And what we can then do is the smarts that we've built into it is the version of the schedule that you want to represent as a baseline can be drawn with a level of transparency. So it sits in the background as a bit of a faded picture. We can even get it to what we call blend, so that we mentioned colors, right? We said, you might have a various range of colors, but what we've said is you might want to represent everything in the baseline just as a gray color, rather than overloading the sensors with too much colors and shapes. You might say everything in the baseline we want represented as a gray line. So the baseline version of the schedule can take on a gray transparent appearance. And then what the third smart thing we've done is, which is again getting into the technical details a little bit, but we allow you to do what's called offsetting. So you can imagine if you've got two areas drawn and your baseline and your forecast has those two areas at the same dates in the same location, they'll actually get drawn on top of one another, and it's very hard to distinguish between the two. So what we've got is the ability to just slightly shift things a little bit, and it creates a bit of a box shadow effect, so that you can see, well, there's our baseline and there's our forecast, and you can see the gap that sticks out.
You kind of mentioned critical path earlier. How was that represented, or is it represented on that chart? Is it possible to see the variations in it within a planning cycle?
So essentially, like I said, we just capture versions of the schedule, whether it's your baseline or your month 6 update. Most scheduling software has a flag that gets added to activities to define whether it's critical or not. And this is typically defined by the options that you set when you calculate your schedule. So for example, if you use Primavera, you might turn around and say anything with less than 5 days of total float is defined as critical. That's set in the scheduling options. And so what Primavera does is, against every activity, there's a yes/no field that says, is this activity critical or not? So we just grab that piece of information. So we pull that into our system that says, is this activity critical or not? And then we have an option that says, for all the activities that are tagged as critical, just display them with a red box. So you can actually visually see a sequence of activities on the chart that represents the critical path of the version of schedule that you're representing.
Excellent. What about, sorry to jump in there, Martin. You mentioned that P6 feeds, or at least the scheduling software feeds into the time change, if it is a software. Can you do it the other way around? Because as you said, sometimes it's useful to have a laminate, and you talk to some of these civil engineers, etc., and they'd love to just use the box and kind of draw it backwards and push, I guess, into the program. So can you use the time chainage to feed backwards?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's two main methods of using these charts. If you're using the former method, where you have got the ability to draw on the chart itself, shift things around and recalculate the network, you can certainly do that, right? So you could, if for instance, the engineer that you're sitting with says, no, look, we need an extra month to do this particular task, you can drag that extra month and then visually see the knock-on effect of all of that. Now, it sounds good, and it sounds like, oh, that's really neat. We're working with this, but the caution that I'll express is that, first of all, the software that can do that type of thing is typically another scheduling engine. So you've now got this state where you may have parts of your schedule in one system and parts of your schedule in another system, because one of the drawback, I won't say it's a drawback, but these time location charts are very well suited to the physical works. You know, you're building a motorway or a tunnel, you've got the physical works for that motorway or tunnel. What they're not necessarily very good at is managing the other aspects of a project. You know, you've got environmental approvals, you've got site access, you've got design, you've got procurement. There's all these other bits and pieces that actually are outside that physical installation of the work. And, you know, to really capture and plan a project correctly, they all need to be connected together and related together. So if you're focusing on just that physical aspect, there is a risk that you may make a change that may not match where you lie with those other aspects of the project, which is where my method, which is work with that integrated information and just draw the charts. So the way we design that software in your little scenario there, Val, is if the engineer suggests some changes on the chart, yes, you could make the change in the chart, but what I would expect is that the planner takes that information away, goes back to the scheduling tool, makes the changes in the scheduling tool, where then you might find out, hey, we can't actually do that because of all these other factors. Or if we make that change, the result is, you know, there's something we hadn't considered on the chart itself. And what I prefer is that you can then redraw that chart very rapidly. So literally every change that you make in the schedule, you need to be able to see the impact on the chart.
So how could the chart show things like contractual dates? Is it just a tag in?
Well, there's a few. I mean, this is where you get to be a little bit creative, and certainly, you know, I tend to think planning and scheduling is just as much art as it is science. And so I, you know, if you did have a contractual date, like let's say a single project completion date, you might, you'll have a milestone for that in your schedule typically. So you might turn around and say, I want to represent that as just a line that spans the full area of my work. So you can draw that on your chart from the start to end on the fixed date for the project completion. So that will just be a line on the chart. And obviously, if you find that some of your tasks are dropping below that line or going over that line, then you have a problem.
Definitely. So just out of interest, I think you've kind of sold Val and I on this as a concept. When you're doing your schedule reviews, when you've got your engineers and project managers stood around the whiteboard or whatever you're using in virtual world, what other metrics are you using alongside that to show your performance? Because that what you're showing there is kind of where you're going, which is, let's face it, the most important part. How do you understand your performance rates to date? Are you hitting what you said you would do? Is that, are there other things that you're using alongside that, or is that the primary planning metric that you're using to?
I don't see these time location charts as being a metric measure as such. I mean, it's really ultimately what it is a graphical representation of the dates, right, from a schedule. So if you're slipping in a certain area, that will just appear as a gap between what you plan to achieve and what you are achieving. But the way I see the time location charts is it's another one of the tools that you use when you're managing these projects. So typically, you know, when you're sitting in a schedule review meeting, not only will you look at, you know, where are we slipping, what's changed to the critical path, and what's our forecast dates, but you'll have all the other metrics that you're using, you know, cubic meters of concrete poured, linear meters of piping laid, whatever KPIs that you're measuring against, you know, number of design packages pumped through the door. So this is just another one of those. It's in, by no means is it meant to replace or override any of those factors. Where I see the benefit of the approach that I advocate is that it's hopefully all coming from the single source of truth. Val, there you go. You know, that rather than it being, I have seen instances where people produce these charts offline. If we say, you know, they may work in a drawing package, or they may work in just Microsoft Excel, where they've manipulated the lines on the chart. And that's where the risk of the disconnect is, that, you know, your schedule says one thing, your KPIs say another thing, and then we've got this chart over here that says a third thing, and all that's going to do is create confusion.
Are there things that can be kind of bolted onto this in the future? So I'm guessing the software can do a certain amount now, and it's showing really visualization. Are there things that you're kind of looking to enhance with it, or maybe 4D or other things?
So we often get asked, how does a time location chart relate to 4D? And my answer is, well, they're complementary, right? They're not competing tools, they're complementary tools. But the fundamental difference between the two is that the time location is ideally a chart that you use to represent the entire schedule, or at least, you know, a big chunk of it. So you might be able to show a 2-year project on one chart, whereas 4D is a snapshot. Effectively, what a 4D is a point in time, and then a series of those points in time clipped together to form an animation, right? So you can imagine when if you've got 4D on your screen, you'll have a timeline, and you drag the timeline to say, well, which, you know, we're starting at this point, we're ending at this point, show me a snapshot at month number 8. Now, if you think about a time location chart, if you've got the dates on the vertical axis, it's like having a line that's running down the page and saying, well, stop at month 8 and tell me where we are on this point in time. One of the I guess one of the main differences between using time location and 4D, if you want, is if you think about an infrastructure project, right? If you think about a railway or a metro, let's say you've got 5 kilometers of this piece of work, and in the middle you've got a station box. So you've got 5,000 meters of work and a 100-meter long station in the middle. That can get lost if you're trying to, you know, when you're looking at a 4D model. If you're trying to view the entire project, you know, the station is a very small component over a very long area, and it can be very hard to see the entire project and look at the detail of that sort of type of information. You've either got to zoom into one particular area and then the rest of it's lost, or you're looking at it at such a high level that the detail is lost. The time location chart can always present you that entire schedule in one view. That's always one of the benefits of it. But I don't think they're competing. I think they're actually complementary. Where, you know, what would be nice in the future is if, you know, the systems were all connected together, and, you know, as a participant on a project, or one of the managers or executives, you had a lovely dashboard that you logged into, and you saw summary, schedule, your 4D option, your time location, and whatever paraphernalia you've got. And it's all, you know, these days, it's much easier to connect the data together. It's more a function of what you want to do with it than what's capable.
Yeah, there's good points. And just speaking to you, Santosh, you speak logic, which is absolutely ridiculous in the disciplines that we're in. How dare you? But why isn't time change as common as you would expect? I mean, we've all been on big projects and a lot of projects, and it's not mentioned. It's not preferred. It's not, there's no discussion about. So if you're drafting, a lot of the times we debate about methodology, which I know you do, and you're very active as well in that space. But we don't necessarily say, well, here's all the options. As you said, like, wouldn't it be nice if we just had, a screen with all the different methodologies and the benefits of, and you plugged in the types and variations and the uniqueness of your particular project as a property, right? And it said, based on the project you have, Santosh, these are the tools we would recommend. And this is how we would, kind of structure it. And these are the documents you would need. And, almost like just giving you that easy sense of, okay, well, I don't have to worry about what I need and what I don't need, because, someone's figured it out, because we surely have. I just don't see what the barrier is. And maybe you've got some insights on why we're not using this more often.
It's a really good question, and one that I really have grappled with for a long time as well. Because I've used them so much in my own work and in my own career, it's second nature to me to just assume that everyone else is doing it. That's a bit of my own bias, I think. In what you mean, you don't know about them, but I think there are a few barriers of entry. One is I think people are under the impression that they do require a lot of work to produce and maintain, and they look very complicated at first. So I'll stick to what I know, right? I think that's one barrier. I think the second barrier has been, even if you are aware of them and know the benefits in using them, the tools and the methods to create them may be out of reach. So, as I said, there is various pieces of software ranging from very cheap to very expensive, and they all vary in the amounts of training that you need to do as well. So some essentially are, you self-learn in a matter of hours, whereas others are more, you need to attend classroom type training for several days to use. And I think the third reason is also just, like anything else, it always comes down to what do the senior executives on a project mandate. Like you'll find that the moment project director says, "Oh, why haven't we done this?" Within a few weeks it's done. Whereas if it's just left up to the project team to come up with, they may go through a cycle of experimenting, figuring out what works best, and tweaking this, tweaking that, and it may take quite a long time to actually get to that point. So I think a lot of it's just down to awareness. It is a strange thing because this is not a new concept, right? This is not these charts are not some modern invention that has only been spurned by the access to computers and things. I've found examples of what is effectively a time location chart dating back to the early 1800s. These charts were being prepared manually when they were first building railways around Europe. They had to determine, well, how are our train timetables going to operate? If a train starts in Paris, how long does it take to get to the next station, and when will it arrive at Lyon? They did them using manual charts drawn where you had location on one axis and time on another axis. So certainly there's a very classic example of the Empire State Building, the delivery of the steel that you can view if you actually visit the Empire State Building, that used what is effectively a time location chart. So it's not a new technique, it's not a new methodology. Perhaps it's just fallen by the wayside as CPMs become a dominant tool, and the PCs meant that what we call precedence diagramming has taken over.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of think you're right, the awareness piece, and hopefully just being on the show today, we'll get a bit more awareness and we can move the needle in the right direction, because I do think it is a good tool. And as you said, it is a complement to the other types of methods that we use, and Critical Path is there. We've had many debates on this show on Critical Path and its place in that planning sphere. And I know you have as well, and it makes us all laugh. But in the serious point, I think, what else can we do? And I wanted to ask you, I know Martin asked you about the future, but are you looking at any innovations to move time chainage to a new direction? Are you looking at how you would integrate it with some of these visual elements? Like we seem to be talking more about the assets rather than just the projects now. So asset management lifecycle through digital twins and the like. Are you seeing this being a continuous complementary piece, or are you looking at ways to integrate it?
We're not actively looking to integrate it with other tools at the moment, and that's not because we don't want to, but when we think about the way that we use these tools, as I mentioned, essentially there's 4 pieces of data for every item that's drawn on these charts, a start and end date and a start and end location, right? So if you've got any tool or any system that can produce that type of information, it may be suitable to producing on these time location charts. So if you think about, like, let's say, typically we're building a highway, and that's a project, you'll have a project schedule that has all that information, fantastic. But what about the next 10 years? What about all the maintenance work that needs to be undertaken over on a highway? You have to replace all sorts of things. You have to run maintenance across this. As long as your system that you're using has got the capacity to say, this is when we're doing something and this is where we'll be doing that thing, you'll be able to put that type of information on these charts. I don't think it's so much a technology thing as much as us just being a little bit more creative in the way we actually use all of that information.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was thinking, because I'm playing around in that virtual space, Santosh. We're doing a lot of just, and play is the right word. So I'm not saying I'm a professional in this, but the metaverse and how we might use spatial tools to understand projects better. And one of the things I was thinking is, because this is when and where, which is actually my understanding now of time chainage. If anyone asks me now, it's like when and where. If you have that data, time chainage would be really useful. I think I could see it. I could see something like that in the virtual space, where it was somehow linked to these visual models of the environment that you're trying to build. Sorry, you're going to say something?
No, go on.
Yeah, so I was thinking, are you playing in this virtual space in terms of awareness and understanding, and maybe making it a bit more interactive?
To be honest, no, because one of the risks that we can have with these charts is to overcomplicate them, and there is a point where it starts becoming a bit counterproductive to bombard with too much information on these charts. I'll give you a very good example, and I think it is okay. Let me start with the example. Consider again a highway, right? You'll have a one carriageway and a second carriageway typically. So you might have a northbound and a southbound carriageway. Now, the way these charts are represented, you have to kind of because you only have one axis, you can't really demonstrate each carriageway as its own axis on these charts unless you have two separate charts. Now, perhaps where you're talking about is I could see potentially one day you putting on these, the virtual reality goggles and stepping into a world where these charts have multiple layers associated with them, if you want to call it that, where you're stepping through potentially each of these carriageways or each of these access points. And you might have a little slider that says, well, show me this particular point in time. But having said that, I think that's where 4D is anyway. I think 4D and BIM provides you with that sort of augmented reality type of view of the world. And you've already got the same dimensions in BIM, where you've got, what is happening, where is it happening, and when is it happening. So I don't know how much more technological solutions we can apply to this technique without making it overly complex and perhaps counterproductive.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think, there you go, mate.
No, I was going to say, I mean, the one area where we could potentially take this is into the field of what is sometimes referred to as linear scheduling. At the moment, the method that I adopt and all the method that all the tools in the marketplace use is ultimately CPM. You calculate a forward pass and a backward pass, and you calculate floats based on that. There are models that I don't know of any software or tools that do this at the moment, but certainly academia has written about it, of what's called linear scheduling. So you can imagine, rather than having to calculate a forward and backward critical path, you're actually doing what's called a down and upward pass. And you're actually calculating criticality based on the position of the lines and the shapes. And you have these terminologies in play, like a controlling activity path and secondary controlling path, getting very complex here. And I don't know of any software in the marketplace that does that type of thing yet. And I dare say they probably won't be, because the market for it's probably quite small.
It'd be a fun exercise to do even in Excel, though, if it is algorithm based and you wanted to just have a bit of a play for all the geeks out there like Martin. We could certainly play with that, because I love the idea of just exploring, the thought experiment of just, what if, and as a planner, a previous planner, and I know you have been as well, what if is such a powerful space that I don't think we get enough time on projects to play in. And you look at the success rate of some of these big projects, Santosh, which we all know so well. It's the same headline everywhere you go, almost around the world. We're not moving the needle effectively. And I know there's multiple facets to that. It's not just planning. But I think in the engine room, planning is the critical point at which we have to be as good as we possibly can, as accurate as we possibly can. And I can see you smiling there. You have some comments for me?
I completely agree with you, and I always do think. I mean, we mentioned that concept of single source of truth, which I step back and I kind of think, when people talk about project schedules, the textbook version of a project schedule is this lovely single item. It's this one schedule. It's developed at the beginning. It might get updated, and you have this lovely project that works on one schedule. But the reality is quite far from that, where it's not necessarily a good thing, but a project will often have multiple versions of schedules. And a lot of it is this what if that you're talking about, where there may be a lot of optioneering going on, saying based on what we've achieved to date, how can we improve what's remaining? And we may be looking at various options. What if we were able to get additional resources to complete the work? What if we were able to maybe work in a different direction, or perhaps combine elements or split elements up? What would that the effect of that? And this is happening every day, right? Every day. I mean, I always say, if the project is going to plan, right, then you should be looking to improve what's left, right? It's rare that a project gets to just sit back in its chair and go, yep, everything's going to plan. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. You're always looking to improve. So there's always multiple versions of schedules. I think, the what if, that scenario building, is an integral part of planning a project. It's very rare that you ever just, develop one plan and walk away from it saying, that's it, that's what we're doing.
You kind of put something in my head. How does it, or can it, handle time risk allowance?
Of itself, it can't, in the sense that it doesn't do any type of risk-based analyses or visualization. However, and it's a good point, because the whole genesis for me developing the software to do this was, I was working on a project a number of years ago where I do a lot of schedule risk analyses as part of the work I do. And we were looking at how do we actually represent the results from the schedule risk analyses in a meaningful way. I mean, you run a Monte Carlo analyses and you get a heap of data from the analyses. And we said, well, on this particular project, we already had a time location chart of the planned schedule. What if we just overlaid the risk adjusted schedule on top of it? And we could very visually see, right, in our deterministic, or the planned, here's when we planned on doing it. But once we add all the risks and potential events and things that could go wrong, how does that drift? And because we had the capacity to overlay data sets on top of one another, so now I do a lot of work now where we actually use these charts and use the outputs from schedule risk analysis and view risk adjusted time location charts. And it's very interesting when you have a planned schedule, and then what we can actually do is overlay, P10, P50, P80, P90 results, each one progressively becoming more and more conservative. And you can actually see the shift in the direction of activities. And when you get to those very high levels of confidence, you can see the dramatic effects of risks impacting the schedule. So you can say, we planned on digging this tunnel from A to B, but once we include all the risks, P90, you can see that extra, we may start at the same time, but we're going to finish 3 months later. Based on the risk profile that we've modeled. Are we doing the right type of analyses? Have we modeled this correctly? Have the inputs been captured correctly? Have we mapped risks to the schedule correctly? All those kind of questions can just jump out at you when you're able to view that information. So in answer to your question, Mark, it of itself can't do risk analyses, but it can very easily show you the results of a schedule risk analysis, because again, it's just the same pieces of information.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think as well, I think what you're saying, even with baselines, is it has the ability to layer. And so you can look at any kind of slippage analysis or baseline analysis, or even TRA as a form of layering visually, which is actually really useful. But is it limited at one layer? Can you? I know you don't want you come back to me kind of saying, don't make it too complicated, Val, because that's what I do. Can you potentially have multiple layers? Is that possible?
The software that we're developing allows you to put up to 3 layers on top of one another, but you can change them at any time. So
Okay.
you might have a baseline, you might have last month's update and your current month's update as those 3 layers, but it's just a simple drop down selector to say, well, which is the one I want to view differently, as long as you've captured all of that data.
Yeah, no, that's great. And
but you're right. I mean, the risk is if you start conveying too much information on these charts, it does end up just being too messy, too noisy, and it starts defeating its purpose of being able to clearly understand, well, this is the where and when.
What about if you've got a really big program and like really big, like Sydney Metro, let's take that. And you've got multiple areas, and usually with these big projects, they're all staged anyway. Can you link multiple, let's say, time chainage charts? So they might have specific purposes or different focuses because of the audience or the stakeholders that are reading them, or because it's linked by different boundaries that are owned by different proprietary systems or teams. Is that possible as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about what these charts represent, when you have a date range, and you might have what we call a location range. So the charts, and certainly the software, because this software is custom built for this type of use, we allow you to limit the ranges on the charts. So you can say, only show me a certain period of dates, or only show me a period of location. You can even filter the type of tasks that are displayed. So you might have 30 odd different types of work in the schedule, but you might want to focus on just 10 of them because the audience you're presenting it to might be, for example, the mechanical and electrical team, right? They don't really care about what's happening in the civil world. They just want to know, when do they get access to their work and what have they planned for their work. So you might turn around and say, well, I'll turn all these other elements off and just focus in on that M&E period. And what you can then do is create multiple charts. So you might have one chart for the M&E team on the northern end of the work, and you may have a second chart for the M&E team on the southern end of the work. Then the commissioning team might say, no, we need to look at the whole of the project. So they may want a chart that shows you. I mean, it's all just effectively their filters applied on the data that's put into the system. So if you have a schedule that has all that information, you can certainly bring it all in and then just select the elements that you want displayed.
That's a good idea, because I think with some of these, maybe the other challenge they might have is just perceiving this is if you're dealing with contractors, and let's say you wanted to use it in a view, but you've got different contractors, you don't necessarily want to show all the work for all contractors, but you won't want to isolate that information. So you can do that with a filtering drop down and just show particular bars and areas. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. That's fantastic. Well, look, we're getting to the end of the episode really quickly, Santosh, and we could have gone down so many rabbit holes. But before we go, we've got a quick pop quiz, 5 questions, just all about yourself. Are you ready to go, mate?
I've been warned about this.
Have you really? Oh, good. They're getting gentler. I think we've gone soft, haven't we, Martin? Now, Martin, you want me to do it, or you're happy for me to kick it off?
Go for it.
Oh, you're a gentleman. Ready, Santosh? Okay, let's go. First one is steak, seafood, or salad?
Oh, salad for me.
Excellent.
What's the best planning software?
The one that gets used.
That's good. What is one piece of advice for people new to the project profession?
Be curious.
What would be your book recommendation to our listeners?
Oh, it's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to sit down and read a good book. I
need to have read it. It'd be an audiobook.
Oh, I'm gonna have to pass on that. I'm at a loss here to suggest I do like to every now and then not read technical books, but it's been a long time since I've had the chance to do that.
Excellent. If you could go back to one moment in your life, what would it be and why?
Ooh, if I could go back to one moment in my life, what would it be and why? Um, Okay, that's a really difficult one to answer. Look, I mean, my parents migrated to Australia a long time ago, and despite the accent, I was born overseas, and I think I would love to go back to that period when they first arrived in this country and better understand how they dealt with all of that. Because I think it's just amazing what they did, and as a child, I don't really had no ability to appreciate what they did to lead us to the world that their kids have now.
That's great. I think there was one more, wasn't there, Martin? Which superpower would you choose to have for a day and why?
Oh, it would. I think it would have to be, the ability to understand what's going on in other people's heads. It would have to be that.
Well, you should have seen that last post I did on LinkedIn where they've converted thoughts to text. Did you see that?
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh, dude, it's scary, man.
That's a scary future.
It's daunting, but yeah, they're getting there. And even basic pictures from dreams, they can start to articulate with AI. So
wow.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. But as long as they can draw a time chainage chart, that's all we have time for today. Mate, any final words or thoughts for our listeners?
No, just as I said, be curious, be adventurous. While we tend to think of engineering and project controls as being a very rigorous, sort of logical and mathematical type of world, there's actually plenty of room for creativity and out of the box type of thinking. And I think that's where you actually see the advancements and the evolution of the industry going is not in just being very rigorous in the logical application, but saying what if we did this, what if we spun it around, what if we twisted it around, what if we took it apart and put it back together again. Be curious.
Yeah, that's great. Martin, anything from you, my friend? Final thoughts?
I think it's something that's really visual, and it helps people to engage with the planning process. It's something Val and I definitely struggle with in London. It makes it visual, it makes it simple, and it's completely linked to the program. So there's no, or doing it your way, there's not a risk of having separate programs.
No, absolutely. Excellent. I mean, anything that gets more people interested in the schedule is not a bad thing.
Exactly. Well said, guys. And we're all better off, or better off having understood at least the basics from Santosh. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you liked what you heard. You can pay it forward by sharing a link to this episode on your social media. A massive thank you to Santosh Bhat for telling us all about time chainage. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Martin, it's bye for now.